Hello, everyone. If you like history that is clear and direct, date, location, people, and reason, you're in the right place. There are moments when policy meets the human body, head-on cold hunger, and the pull of the North. We open the file at the source of every decision, Fort Robinson, January 1879, context actors, and the central question. A hard winter holds the White River Valley in January 1879. Snow tightens around Fort Robinson, Nebraska, where more than 100 Northern Cheyenne families sit confined in a log barracks, while soldiers of the 3rd United States Cavalry stand guard outside. Inside, the leaders are Morning Star, also known as Dull Knife, and his kinsman. Outside, the post commander is Captain Henry W. Wessels, bound to orders from Washington to send these people south to Indian Territory. The setting is precise. The date is January 9, 1879, Fort Robinson, Nebraska. The band that reached this post in late October came north after a year of sickness and hunger on the southern reservation. They petitioned to live near Powder River and Tongue River, close to their dead in their winter ranges, and believed they had been promised a chance to return after 1 year. The order that arrived after New Year demanded the opposite, when they refused to board transport rations and fuel were cut off to compel obedience. The principal actors are not a field army, but families under guard and an American garrison executing policy. The stakes are immediate heat-food custody of leaders and the direction of travel. They are also larger than the parade ground. If the Northern Cheyenne accept removal, they return to the place where their children sickened. If they resist, they gamble lives on winter ground under pursuit. The decision made on this night will send small parties into coulees and bluffs and leave bodies in the snow within days. The guiding question is simple and difficult. Why did the Northern Cheyenne choose to break out of Fort Robinson rather than submit to removal back to Indian Territory? And how did that choice reshape the government's handling of where the Northern Cheyenne would live in the years that followed? Snow and policy converged long before the night at Fort Robinson, Nebraska. The treaty framework after the 1868 Fort Laramie Agreement left Northern Cheyenne land and movement bound to agencies aligned with Oglala and Brule on the Upper Platte and White River. Through the early 1870s, the pressure lines tightened Union Pacific traffic across the Platte homestead. Fillings in Kansas and Nebraska, and gold strikes in the Black Hills after 1874 drew settlers and army posts into the northern plains. Buffalo herds collapsed across the decade, first south of the Platte, and then north toward Powder River. A people built around winter ranges horse herds, and mobile hunting now faced empty ranges and ration lines at agencies that moved as federal policy shifted. The jurisdiction line mattered. Indian affairs had been placed under the Interior Department since 1849, but Army columns still enforced movement and peace policy during campaigns. After the 1876 to 1877 fighting that followed, the Little Bighorn Summer Northern Cheyenne bands surrendered near the Red Cloud and Spotted Tail agencies with an understanding they would be placed and supplied. In August 1870, transport orders sent them to Indian Territory at the Cheyenne and Arapaho Reservation near the Canadian River. The climate was unfamiliar. The game base was thin and disease took hold through late 1807 and early 1878. Chiefs asked for a 1-year trial with the right to go north at its end. By the summer of 1878, with deaths mounting and rations short, patience ended. The northward departure began on 9th of September 1878 from the Darlington Agency in Indian Territory. The column that left contained roughly 300 people with fewer than 100 fighting men. The objective was explicit reach Powder River and Tongue River country before winter. The route angled across the Arkansas and Republican River watersheds, always seeking cover and water always watched. Posts at Fort Dodge, Kansas, Fort Wallace, Kansas, and Fort McPherson, Nebraska, sent detachments to intercept. Skirmishes flared at streams and draws along the Solomon and the Republican. On 27th of September 1878, near Punished Woman Fork in present-day Scott County, Kansas, a running fight with a pursuing column ended with the death of Lieutenant Colonel William H. Lewis and a night escape through a side ravine. The pattern held through October. Brief contact hard marches, split decisions to shield families, then another sprint north. Logistics for the Northern Cheyenne were austere and unforgiving. Ammunition was limited and had to be conserved for rear guard actions. Food came from short hunting forays, seized stock, and whatever could be traded or begged from isolated settlements. Many children were sick from the southern year, horses thinned with the miles. Remounts taken on the trail were often poor. The band divided its risks by splitting. Little Wolf took the faster striking group aimed at Powder River. Morning Star, also known as Dull Knife, slowed with families and sick, and looked for an army post where he could ask to remain in the north without inviting immediate annihilation. The United States' objective was to enforce the order that Northern Cheyenne belonged on the southern reservation, to reassure settlers along the Republican and Solomon that raids and alarms would end, and to avoid setting a precedent that a determined flight could reverse federal placement. Constraints were real. Winter closed roads and slowed columns. Public scrutiny rose with each civilian death reported along the route. Coordination between interior officials, territorial governors, and Army district commanders was not always smooth. Posts had to keep garrisons ready while also protecting stage lines and ranches. In late October 1878, Dull Knife's group chose Fort Robinson, Nebraska. The logic was tactical and political. The post sat within reach of Lakota relatives near the White River agencies. It had food shelter and a commander who could telegraph up the chain for a decision. On arrival, the families were disarmed and confined to a long log barracks under guard. Through November, councils ran at the post. Red Cloud visited and spoke with the leaders. Delegations argued that the people needed to remain in the North to live. The post reported conditions calmly and waited for direction. Winter pressure mounted inside the room as the year turned. Rations were never generous and fuel was scarce. After New Year, the answer from higher command arrived. The order was to transport the Northern Cheyenne back to Indian Territory at once. When the leaders refused to board wagons or rail, the garrison cut off rations and fuel to compel compliance. Mothers scraped frost from logs for water and burned scraps to warm infants. Guards tightened the cordon. On 9 January, soldiers seized 2 leading men and put them in irons. That arrest added to cold and hunger, fixed the choice that had been forming since the Darlington departure. Each side now had immediate triggers and near-term objectives. For the Northern Cheyenne, the objective was to avoid return to a place that had already killed their children and to reach friendly ground toward Pine Ridge Agency and beyond to Tongue River. The constraint was everything: cold hunger, limited arms, the presence of many women and children, and armed pickets outside the windows. Their logistics snapshot on the eve of the attempt was stark. A handful of rifles and pistols smuggled in pieces, few cartridges, winter clothing worn thin, and no horses. For the Fort Robinson Command, the objective was to execute the removal order without a public disaster. Constraints included short garrison strength, sub-zero weather, and the optics of starving families in a barracks. The logistics snapshot on the post side showed carbines fixed positions around the parade ground, mounted detachments for pursuit and supply, but no easy way to move unwilling prisoners in deep winter without force. Policy terrain and time thus converged. A treaty world built for fixed agencies collided with a people who judged that staying south meant death. Railroad lines and homestead grids narrowed maneuver space. Interior orders overlaid Army enforcement. The final push came from ration cuts, fuel denial, and arrests inside a wooden room in a fort on the White River in the second week of January, 1879. A hard line of dates begins in late October 1878, when Morning Star, also known as Dull Knife, brought his people to Fort Robinson, Nebraska. The band had split from Little Wolf on the Republican River and arrived at the White River post hungry and short on ammunition. The garrison received them, disarmed the men, and confined families in a long log barracks near the parade ground. Through November, the weather turned, thin snow crusted the yard, and councils met under close guard. Messages moved by telegraph from the post to the Department of the Platte and back again. Interpreters carried words between Red Cloud and the Cheyenne leaders, then repeated them to the post commander. Each exchange took hours. Each return wire from the department took a day or more. The immediate effect was stasis with a slow tightening, families kept inside pickets posted at night, and the band's horses corralled under Army control. The signal traffic itself became part of the pressure, an open reminder that the decision did not lie with anyone in the room. Early December added winter weight to a political delay. The agency and post accounts agreed that sickness persisted among children and elders. Fuel was limited, and guards watched even the issue of wood. When Red Cloud visited in December, he urged caution and made plain that permission to remain in the North would depend on orders arriving from elsewhere. The Cheyenne leaders repeated their request: stay near their northern ranges where relatives could help and where the climate did not make their children ill. The post reported the talks with care. Snow deepened along the White River bluffs, and the barracks door stayed barred. What began as a temporary stop while decisions were sought had become a locked room, whose only opening was a telegraph line that did not yet carry the answer the families needed. The first dated break in that waiting came on 3rd of January 1879. A telegram brought the direction that the Northern Cheyenne were to be sent back to the reservation in Indian Territory without delay. The order was read at the post and relayed into the barracks by interpreters. The people refused to board wagons or rail. The commander responded by cutting off rations and fuel to compel obedience. Nights were already sub-zero, and the effect was immediate. Women scraped frost from the inside of logs for water. Infants were wrapped in every scrap of cloth. Men who had been disarmed months earlier now set to work with quiet resolve on a different kind of preparation. In the first days after the cutoff, families dismantled and hid anything that could be used as a weapon. Some who had smuggled metal parts into the post when they first arrived reassembled pistols and short rifles after dark. Guards tightened their pacing outside, and a file of troopers slept in rotation within earshot of the door. From the command side, signals turned into deadlines. The post reported the refusal and the coercive steps taken. Department headquarters expected quick execution of the removal. Couriers rode between outbuildings and the telegraph office in long steps to keep the wires moving. Within the barracks, the interpreter's role became central and fraught. A message spoken in English had to pass into Cheyenne with as little loss of precision as possible, then be returned again in English to confirm the answer. The delay in each turn stretched hours while the stove went unlit. The garrison's logistical picture was simple, and strong cartridges for the 3rd United States Cavalry carbines, mounted detachments ready for pursuit, and steady food and wood for troops. The prisoner's picture was the reverse. No issued rations, no fuel, no horses, limited arms, sick children, and a finite number of cartridges for the few weapons they had. On 9th of January, the pressure sun sharpened into a trigger. In the afternoon, 2 leading men were seized and put in irons, a move intended to break resistance by removing ringleaders before transport south. The arrest sent the signal the families had feared. Since the order arrived, any further delay would be answered by force against their leaders first, then the rest. By evening, the sky cleared and temperatures fell. Guards called the hour. The post settled into its winter routine. The barracks sat dark. Inside, adults whispered to children and moved them toward the places where shutters and window frames had loosened in the cold. Short before 10 at night, men slipped through openings and fired at the nearest sentries to break the ring. Women and older boys followed, carrying infants and pulling younger children through the snow-crusted sills. The first volley on the parade ground brought the garrison out in alarm, and a skirmish line formed between the barracks and the low bluffs to the northwest. In the immediate aftermath of the first shots, signals again shaped what happened next. Drums and bugles sounded to rouse sleeping details. Runners moved to saddle horses. A telegraph message went to district headquarters reporting an outbreak in progress. The post's response doctrine, secure the buildings, establish a line mount. A pursuit met the family's plan to scatter into broken ground. Snow lay in uneven crusts along the coulees, and visibility was good under cold starlight. Small groups angled toward the draws that fed Antelope Creek. Others tried for the White River bottoms. On the ground, immediate effects were brutal. Several soldiers fell near the windows. Cheyenne men took wounds while covering women and children, and those too slow to move away were captured in the first minutes. By first light on 10th of January, the post shifted from alarm to pursuit. Mounted detachments followed tracks where snow had drifted and preserved the night's passage. Couriers moved along the skirmish line and back to the post with ammunition and hot coffee for the men on the bluffs. Interpreters were brought forward with the columns to call for surrender when small family groups were found. A file of prisoners taken in the first hours was marched back to the post under guard. In the draws, wind cut through brush and new snow began to fall. The pressure now escalated with each hour of cold. Families that had escaped the parade ground now had to choose between speed and concealment. Many chose to hide in pockets of brush, hoping the storm would cover tracks. A second incident on 11th of January fixed the pattern that followed. A small party with 2 wounded elders and several children was discovered in a shallow ravine less than 10 miles from the post. The ground offered little protection. An interpreter called out that the soldiers would not fire if the group came in. The answer was silence and movement deeper into the brush. Shots were exchanged in short bursts. The elders were killed. The survivors were taken back to the fort, where they joined those already confined. The telegraph line carried the report to headquarters the same evening. Newspapers in nearby towns ran brief items the next day, and ranch families along Hat Creek shifted children into closer quarters, wary of both fugitives and patrols. The pursuit widened after 12th of January, and the distance from the fort stretched to dozens of miles. Snow and wind erased some tracks and highlighted others. On 14th January, a larger remnant hid in a low hollow above Antelope Creek. The cupped ground gave cover from line of sight, but trapped those inside if mounted troops reached the rim. Scouts pointed out the position to the advancing detachment. The officer in charge called forward an interpreter, and a final request to surrender was made over open ground. What came back was a burst of fire from the hollow rim. The detachment replied, then advanced by rushes. When the fight ended, bodies lay tangled among brush and snow, and a handful of survivors were marched to the rear. Across these days, a single official voice captured the logic of the post's actions in cold language. Wessel's report, Fort Robinson, January 1879. Orders require their return south. I have notified the prisoners that rations are suspended until compliance. Every effort will be made to prevent escape. If an attempt is made, the guard will act to suppress it with necessary force. The narrative returned to its plain course after that entry. Weather and wires kept shaping outcomes. Each day, the post sent and received messages, while detachments traced the bluffs and creek bottoms for signs of those still at large. Each recovery tightened the sense that the episode could only end in two ways: surrender under escort back to the post, or death in the snow. The families that had chosen the night run on 9 January continued to split conceal and move when they could. The soldiers continued to fix call for surrender and close. By the third week of January, pressure that began with a telegram and a fuel cutoff had escalated through a arrest breakout and running fights into a winter campaign measured in miles of coolies and names entered into post returns. Snow and orders defined the campaign that followed the night run of 9th of January 1879. The garrison at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, put into motion a simple order of battle. Detachments of the 3rd United States Cavalry, under Captain Henry W. Wessels, formed a skirmish line between the Long Log Barracks and the low bluffs northwest of the parade ground, then mounted a pursuit at first light. Scouts and civilian employees rode as guides. An interpreter accompanied the forward elements whenever contact was likely. The Northern Cheyenne formation was not a war party, but a fleeing community, divided into small groups, a thin rear guard of fighting men with a few rifles and pistols, many women, children and elders on foot, and almost no horses. Ammunition was scarce. Clothing was worn down by a year of travel. Food was what could be carried in blankets and bags. The rules of engagement were set by message the week before. Department headquarters had directed the post to send the Cheyennes south without delay and to prevent escape. The post commander, following that instruction, cut rations and fuel on 3rd January and ordered the guard to stop any attempt to break custody. A short written line captures the tone: rations are suspended until compliance. If an attempt is made, the guard will act to suppress it with necessary force. The scope was clear and narrow: compel transport, prevent flight. There was no separate judicial process at the post. The legal authority was the federal power to remove the band to the assigned reservation. The march rendered in ground terms looked like this. On 10 January, from Fort Robinson to the first coulees west of the post patrols, followed crisp tracks where the night cold had hardened the snow. The terrain was broken the grass country, cut by draws that fed Antelope Creek. Choke points were the narrow gullies leading out of each hollow. The tactical problem for the fugitives was to pass those necks before mounted men closed the rim. Wind carried sound along the bluffs. Any shot brought riders at a trot. The first day's contacts were brief. A file of families caught within sight of the post surrendered and was marched back. A small party tried to slip through to Willow along the White River and was taken in the afternoon. By dusk, the main remnant had angled north-northwest toward the upper forks of Antelope Creek, where coulees deepen and provide short deceptive cover. Logistics stress pressed both sides, but in different ways. The garrison had food wood and cartridges, but limited men to watch all exits and long cold hours to stand. Horses sweated into frost. Saddles froze hard if left off too long. Couriers moved between the telegraph office and the line to keep headquarters informed. Coffee and ammunition were sent forward by hand in the dark. The Northern Cheyenne had almost nothing beyond what they wore and carried. Blankets froze, moccasins stiffened, breath hung in the still air and betrayed positions. Cartridges were counted, shots were husbanded. The decision to hide rather than run long distances became the default because speed burned strength too quickly. On 11th of January, the pursuit crossed us 10 miles of broken ground west and slightly north of the post. A party with 2 wounded elders and several children was found in a shallow ravine. The officer in charge called forward the interpreter to offer terms. The answer was movement deeper into brush and a short exchange of fire. The elders were killed. Survivors were marched back under guard to the post. That day's action set a pattern call to surrender first when non-combatants were clearly present, then close by or rushes if fire came back. The immediate humanitarian outcome at the post was basic prisoners were fed, warmed, and confined again. The wounded on both sides were treated by the post surgeon in cramped rooms already crowded with guards and supplies. The maneuver picture broadened after 12th of January. Detachments worked in pairs along parallel draws, one holding a rim while the other probed the next feeder gully. The choke points multiplied. A few miles gained in the open could be undone by a single misread in the folds of ground where a hidden group might freeze in place for hours while riders passed 70 yards above. Snow and wind shifted through the 13th, erasing some tracks and sharpening others into hard signatures where drifts had packed. A small fire lit under brush for a sick child left a dark scar against white and drew patrols like a beacon. First contact with the largest remnant came on 14 January above Antelope Creek. The position was a low-cupped hollow with brush and snow packed tight against the earth. It offered concealment against line of sight from level ground, but left little maneuver room once a mounted force reached the rim. An interpreter called out that no shots would be fired if the group came in. What came back was a volley from the edge of the brush, likely an attempt to break a ring that had already formed. The detachment replied by sections and advanced by rushes. When the firing ended, bodies lay mixed among brush and drift. A handful of survivors were taken to the rear. Casualty ranges for the running fights of 10 to 22 January differ by source. Post returns and state compilations converge that dozens of Northern Cheyenne were killed over the 12 days, and that roughly the same number were recaptured and marched back to Fort Robinson. Soldier fatalities are recorded in low numbers, relative to the total, most in the first minutes, at the barracks windows and in a few close contacts thereafter. The precise tally varies across reports. The narrative can fix trends with confidence. Most of the dead on the Cheyenne side were non-combatants or men shot while covering the movement of families. Most of the soldiers fell in the initial surprise or in tight ground at short range. Frostbite and exposure compounded losses after each fight. As the days passed, command shifted. By 19 January, Major Andrew W. Evans assumed responsibility for operations in the field, while Wessels maintained the post. The rules did not change. Headquarters still expected the removal to be completed and the fugitives to be stopped. A clipped after-action line captures the state of the pursuit on a mid-month evening. Tracks numerous in all draws west of Antelope. Parties scattered, weather steady below zero. We continue to call for surrender where women and children are seen. If they fire, we close. That cadence repeated across the last week of the campaign. Non-combatant outcomes remained at the center of each decision. Interpreters stood forward under fire to call terms. In several instances, small groups surrendered when infants could no longer be kept warm. Those who came in were placed again under guard. Women and children were fed and warmed. The wounded were dressed as best as the surgeon could manage. There was no separate civilian relief structure. Every act of aid happened inside a military facility whose mission remained removal south. The contradiction ran through every hour of the campaign. A post-hospital dressing Cheyenne wounds, in rooms a few steps from a telegraph office wiring progress reports on the enforcement of an order the same patients had resisted. Arrest and seizure marked the administrative side. Weapons found on prisoners were logged. A few pistols and short rifles with limited cartridges were recorded. Blankets and personal goods were stacked and inventoried. The 2 leaders seized on 9th of January remained in irons. New arrests followed each contact as smaller groups were located and brought in. When bodies were found after fights in the draws, soldiers and local civilians buried them quickly in shallow ground hard as iron. One site near Antelope Creek later carried a local name and long memory as a mass grave. The logistics of burial under those conditions were blunt. Frozen earth chopped open, brush pulled aside, snow heaped back over. It was not ceremony, but necessity. The Cheyenne command problem was to preserve any corps capable of reaching friendly ground. Small parties tried to slip east toward Lakota, relatives near the White River agencies, or north toward the Powder River line. Morning Star, also known as Dull Knife, moved with a tiny family group in that direction and avoided contact by turning when patrols appeared on a rim. That success was an exception. Most who left the barracks on 9th of January had been fixed by the second week and either killed in place or taken back to Fort Robinson. The doctrine the Army applied was the doctrine of pursuit and pinning in winter country. It was tactically sound against civilians with a thin rear guard and no horses. 2 short disputes sit at the edge of the record and deserve brief marking. Fact versus folklore appears first in the account of how weapons reached the barracks. Many narratives assert that women smuggled barrels, cylinders, and frames under clothing when the band was disarmed in late October, then reassembled them by lamplight in January. The pattern is consistent across early 20th century retellings and aligns with the number and type of weapons later seized, but exact lists by item and bearer are scarce. Precision about who carried what is therefore best treated as probable practice rather than fixed fact. A second dispute concerns the precise soldier casualty count in the opening minutes at the barracks. Some local accounts enlarge the figure. Post-return suggest fewer killed than later memory supplied. The trend is not contested soldiers fell in the first volley at the windows, but the exact number varies. By 22nd January, the pursuit had burned itself down into a tally rather than a hunt. The bluffs and coulees west and north of Fort Robinson were laced with short tracks that ended in capture burial, or a line of footprints turning toward Pine Ridge Agency. The garrison had executed the removal order in the only way it could once the barracks door had opened by force under winter conditions, over short distances where every fold of ground had to be read at a walk. The Northern Cheyenne had made the opposite choice and paid accordingly, yet one strategic fact was now visible to every office that handled the wires. Even after the bodies were counted and the survivors were marched back to the post, the pressure that produced the breakout persisted, a people determined not to live in the South. A winter campaign that could not resolve that determination, and a question on a clerk's desk in a department office about what to do next. Snow wire and orders converged into a single moment on the Antelope Creek bluffs. The who, where, and when are precise. The pursuers were detachments of the 3rd United States Cavalry from Fort Robinson, Nebraska, under Captain Henry W. Wessels, with Major Andrew W. Evans assuming field responsibility by the 3rd week of January. The pursued were Northern Cheyenne families who had slipped the barracks on the night of 9 January 1879, and were now hiding in coulees west and north of the post. The immediate objective on the Army side was to execute the removal order without delay and to prevent further escape. The objective on the Cheyenne side was to preserve life long enough to reach friendly ground near the White River agencies, or failing that to buy time for small parties to get away. Constraints defined everything. Ammunition for the Cheyenne was counted, cartridge by cartridge, often a handful per weapon, the weapons themselves smuggled into the post in pieces months earlier and reassembled by lamplight. Rations were whatever a person could carry on the night of the breakout. Clothing was thin from a year's flight. Children were already sick from the southern year and now faced sub-zero air. The garrison had food wood and cartridges, but too few men to watch every draw horses that tired in deep cold, and orders that left little space for patience. Weather was the common enemy, clear still, and colder by the hour, a condition that preserved tracks in hard crust and punished any body that stopped moving for long. The initiative shifted on 14th January above Antelope Creek. A remnant, men, women, and children, hid in a low hollow that gave concealment from level ground, but trapped anyone inside once mounted men reached the rim. An interpreter called for surrender. A volley answered. The detachment replied by sections and advanced by rushes. When the firing ended, bodies lay laced with brush and snow. Survivors were taken to the rear. That fight was the hinge, because it collapsed the largest pocket still at large, and told every remaining family in the draws that the ring had closed. After that day, the campaign became a collection of final acts. A child carried from brush to a saddle, a small group, walking back under guard, a pair of men slipping away along a creek line and vanishing toward Pine Ridge Agency. Morning Star, also known as Dull Knife, moved with a tiny party in that direction and evaded contact by turning when riders showed on a rim. Most did not. 2 lines from a policymaker explain why the ring had to close rather than bend. Sheridan Letter, Washington, November 1878. The whole reservation system will be endangered unless every one of these Indians are taken back and made to stay. That admission runs against the softer claims sometimes made later about discretion on the ground. It meant the local commander's freedom of action narrowed to compulsion, cut rations, confine, seize leaders, stop the breakout, and move the survivors south. The human cost is traceable in names and places, even when tallies differ. Wild Hog and Old Crow were seized on 9th of January and kept in irons while their families were removed from the barracks. Men covering windows that night were killed at close range. Women and children fell in the draws in the days after. The ground above Antelope Creek still holds the memory of a mass grave made under winter duress, frozen earth, hacked open brush dragged aside, snow packed back over. In later years, Northern Cheyenne winter counts marked the season as the time of the Fort Prison Break, or the time of running from the house, a motif that compressed weather wire and orders into a single glyph and placed the dead in the long cycle of years. The displacement path that follows is equally clear. A column of captives returned to Fort Robinson under guard. A handful of families moved east to Lakota relatives. Little Wolf's separate band, never caught, reached Fort Keogh and secured permission to stay in the north. Survivors would be reunited only slowly, as agencies and departments argued over what the government would recognize. A brief counterfactual can be framed from the record without speculation beyond the sources. If department headquarters had permitted a spring removal, or better recognized a northern residence before the first week of January, the decisive fight above Antelope Creek likely never occurs. The barracks need not become a winter prison. The guard does not stand between families and a woodpile. If, on the other hand, the post had kept rations and fuel flowing after 30 January, while telegraphing for reconsideration, The breakout might have been delayed long enough for a different directive to arrive, but only if that directive conceded the core Cheyenne demand to stay in the north. Both conditions run against the order Sheridan articulated. They show how little room the garrison had once policy fixed the line. The turning point also exposes the limits of improvisation. The Cheyenne plan was as sound as conditions allowed, split into small groups. Move by night, choose ground that masked line of sight, and conserve cartridges for the moment. A ring closed. Against mounted men with ammunition, a telegraph line, and authority to compel that plan could buy hours and sometimes days, but not a season. The Army plan was the pursuit doctrine for winter country against fugitives, hold rims, probe, draws, call for surrender through an interpreter, and close-by rushes if fired upon. Against a community with many non-combatants and no horses, that doctrine would always tend toward capture and death more than negotiation. The decisive contact above Antelope Creek made that distinction visible in a single contour of ground, a cupped hollow that looked like shelter and became a trap as soon as riders reached the edge. Names on the Army side help keep the account exact. Wessels held post command through 19th of January. Evans took field lead as the search widened, and company officers rotated sections along the bluffs. On the Cheyenne side, Morningstar moved as a family head rather than a battlefield captain. Other men, left-hand little fingernail tangle hair, appear in lists as killed or captured. The casualty ranges converge in trend, if not in exact figures. Dozens of Cheyenne were killed over 12 days. Roughly the same number were recaptured. Soldier fatalities were lower in total and fell earliest largely at the windows on 9th of January, and in tight ground thereafter. Exposure and frostbite deepened loss on both sides and explain why several small groups surrendered when children could no longer be kept warm. One clipped after action line speaks to the cold mechanics of the week without special pleading. Evans' field report near Antelope Creek, January 1879. Tracks numerous in all draws, parties scattered, weather steady below zero. We continue to call for surrender where women and children are seen. If they fire, we close. It is an admission of method and of its consequences under that sky. Folded back into the structural forces already laid out, the turning point becomes less a single fight than a proof. Treaties and agency rules fixed people to places that could not support them once buffalo herds collapsed and homestead grids and rail lines narrowed every option. Administration of Indian Affairs by Interior overlaid enforcement by Army, which meant policy made in an office arrived at a wooden door as orders to cut fuel and food. When chiefs' petitions for a return north failed, a winter of sickness and short rations became a trigger as real as any shot. On 14 January, the geography of the bluffs and the geometry of orders met. The initiative shifted because there was no mechanism inside the policy to bend. The campaign ended as it had to end under that policy, and the argument about where the Northern Cheyenne would live moved from a barracks in Nebraska to a desk in Washington, carried there by the reports of a breakout that winter had made decisive. Snow and gunfire ended the January 1879 pursuit, but the aftermath unfolded in offices, courts, agencies, and schools. In the weeks after the Antelope Creek fights, United States officers assembled lists of dead and living inventoried weapons and reported that surviving Northern Cheyenne from the Fort Robinson barracks were again under guard. A separate legal track opened in Kansas. Several Northern Cheyenne men, including Wild Hog and Porcupine, were carried to Dodge City to face charges tied to the northbound flight. While awaiting proceedings, they drew narrative images that encoded the journey and losses. Later accounts note the men ultimately prevailed in court and returned to the north. Those ledger drawings survive as a record of memory and intent produced inside a jail before the people had a recognized homeland. Reservation status came next by executive order rather than treaty. On 26 November 1884, the executive branch set apart a Northern Cheyenne Reserve at Tongue River Agency in Montana Territory. On 19th of March 1900, a second executive order withdrew a larger described tract from sale and settlement and formalized it as the Northern Cheyenne Indian Reservation for the permanent use and occupation of the people already living there. Those two instruments, 1884 to establish, 1900 to confirm and bound, fixed the legal home in the North that had been the object of the 1878-1879 exodus. Administration then turned to land tenure and resources. Congress's Northern Cheyenne Allotment Act of 3 June 1926 authorized the allotment of surface parcels to individuals but explicitly reserved the underlying coal and other mineral deposits for the tribe. Half a century later, in Northern Cheyenne Tribe v. Hollow Breast, the United States Supreme Court read Section 3 of the 1926 Act to confirm that reservation coal and other minerals remain tribal property, not vested in individual allottees, an interpretation that shaped later leasing and development decisions across the reservation. Subsequent federal reporting and hearings continued to treat Northern Cheyenne minerals as a tribal trust resource. Agency files from the period show the routine machinery that governed daily life as the people adjusted to a fixed homeland. The Bureau of Indian Affairs and its Northern Cheyenne Agency preserved records on rations, censuses, school placements, and land use decisions. Allied series from Cheyenne and Arapaho Agency document the Southern year that preceded the flight north, with ledgers on annuities and issue lists that frame the hunger and sickness complaints of 1807 to 1878. Those paper trails, rations, and rolls anchor what later oral history remembers about shortages and enforced immobility. Education became a parallel administrative arm. Catholic missionaries founded St. Lebre Mission and School near the Tongue River in 1884 before the reservation was formally described in 1900. The school network grew into a system, serving Northern Cheyenne and neighboring communities. In the early 20th century, the Tongue River Boarding School at Busby opened under federal authority, part of a wider boarding school regime that pressed English and craft curricula. After the self-determination era, the tribe chartered a community college at Lame Deer in 1975, now Chief Dull Knife College, which serves as a center for higher education and language programming on the reservation. These institutions mark a shift from external to tribally directed schooling within the same homeland the Exodus had sought. Demography and health statistics trace the long recovery after the 1870s collapse. Contemporary state and federal profiles list roughly 11,000 enrolled Northern Cheyenne members, with about 5,000 residents on the reservation. The Bureau of Indian Affairs Agency today stewards more than 540,000 surface acres in trust. Those numbers give scale to household formation, school enrollments, and health planning, and set the denominator for programs that address chronic conditions and water quality, the latter visible in recent watershed plans issued in cooperation with federal partners. Cultural continuance has been deliberate and public. The Northern Cheyenne name themselves Tsitsistas, and language work has moved from short community classes to immersion camps and media projects anchored in Lame Deer. A 2-week summer immersion camp at Crazy Head Springs, documented by educators from Chief Dull Knife College, became a durable model for teaching Cheyenne to younger speakers. National Humanities grants in the 2000s supported a Northern Cheyenne Endangered Language project. Ongoing consortium efforts and college programs keep Cheyenne in daily use alongside English. These efforts carry forward ceremonial life and seasonal observances within the constraints of wage work and school calendars, reversing earlier agency rules that once restricted travel and gatherings. Memory also returned to the places where the 1879 decisions were made. In the early 1990s, following the Federal Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, Northern Cheyenne representatives worked with Nebraska officials to recover and rebury ancestral remains discovered near Fort Robinson. State Museum records preserve images of the handover. Each January since the mid-90s, Northern Cheyenne youth and mentors run the Fort Robinson Outbreak. Spiritual run a 400-mile relay from the White River Bluffs to Busby or Bernie in Montana, beginning at the exact hour of the 9 January breakout. The run is an act of prayer endurance and mapping. It places feet on the same winter ground the families crossed and returns the story to community hands. Ledger art and winter count practice knit the legal and human strands together. The jail ledgers drawn in early 1879 by Wild Hog and others recorded not only fights and arrests, but also kinship scenes and ceremonial signs, translating a mobile plains record system into bound paper narratives as the people moved into fixed agency life. Scholars and museum projects have since located, scanned, and interpreted those notebooks, connecting them to broader Plains ledger and winter count traditions that compressed a year's decisive event into a single emblem. In Northern Cheyenne, telling the motif for the season of 1879 folds the prison house and the night run into a compact sign the community can carry. Present-day administration reflects the balance the Exodus forced onto the national agenda. The Northern Cheyenne Tribal Council governs from Lame Deer across 5 districts. Tribal programs manage education, health, and cultural resources, and the agency coordinates federal trust responsibilities. Mineral policy remains shaped by the 1926 Act and later court rulings with leasing authority and proceeds subject to tribal decision within federal frameworks. The reservation's institutions, public schools, St. Lebre Northern Cheyenne Tribal School, and Chief Dull Knife College now operate alongside cultural programs that privilege Cheyenne speech and ceremony as living practices rather than museum subjects. Seen against the structural forces identified earlier, Buffalo Collapse rail and homestead grids and the transfer of Indian affairs to interior with Army enforcement, the continuance path is legible. The people who fled Fort Robinson chose death risks in winter over a southern placement they judged unlivable. Within 5 years, executive orders conceded a northern homeland. Within 2 decades, Congress fixed mineral control at the tribal level and pushed allotment within reservation boundaries. A century later, repatriation and youth commemoration recentered the story on Cheyenne terms. The administration of rations and arrests that once defined life at agencies has been joined and in crucial spheres replaced by tribal government language work and annual acts of memory that begin at the same hour the windows opened in January 1879 and point the same way the families wanted to go. Across a century and a half, 3 points formed the broad scholarly consensus. First, the breakout was the predictable result of structural failure, a forced migration to a southern reservation, with inadequate rations, unfamiliar climate, and high sickness, combined with rigid removal orders that left no lawful path back north. Second, the episode directly accelerated recognition of a Northern Cheyenne homeland in Montana. The people's refusal to remain south, even at winter risk, made a northern residence a federal necessity rather than a discretionary favor. Third, the event reveals the practical limits of coercive reservation policy. Army enforcement could compel bodies in the short term, but it could not secure long-term consent when food health and kin geography all pointed the other way. Contested points remain. Casualty figures vary across post-return state compilations and later retellings. Most historians settle on dozens of Northern Cheyenne killed, and roughly as many recaptured, with soldier deaths, far fewer, but the exact tallies differ. Responsibility is also debated. Some writers emphasize the narrow latitude of the post command under departmental orders, while others fault local decisions such as cutting fuel and rations in sub-zero weather and seizing leaders on the eve of removal. Motive and framing divide interpretations as well. Official language long labeled the event an outbreak, implying a prison revolt, whereas Northern Cheyenne accounts describe a necessary escape by families facing renewed transport to a place they believed would kill their children. Even the detail of smuggled weapons sits at the edge of the record. Early narratives agree that pieces were hidden and reassembled, but precise inventories and carriers are sparse, so most scholars treat it as probable practice rather than fixed fact. The enduring legacy spans policy law and memory. In policy terms, the episode marks a pivot from pure containment toward grudging geographic accommodation, culminating in executive orders establishing and then bounding the reservation at Tongue River. In law, later rulings on Northern Cheyenne land and minerals, especially the confirmation of tribal ownership of subsurface resources, despite allotment, encode a durable form of collective control that the Exodus had demanded in geographic form. In community life, the story lives through ceremony, language programs, ledger art recollection, winter count motifs that compress the time of running from the house into a single emblem, and the Fort Robinson outbreak spiritual run that retraces the midwinter route each January from the White River bluffs to the homeland. Those practices place names back on ground, tie youth to elders' decisions, and keep the meaning of the choice legible without sentiment. Placed within the longer arc, the Fort Robinson breakout is neither a standalone tragedy nor a minor footnote. It is a proof that family survival strategies can force a sovereign system to redraw its map. It endures in memory because on a freezing night, people chose the risk of snow and pursuit over a return to a place they knew would end them, and by doing so, they made the North their home. The narrative closes, but debate stays open. Was it an outbreak or an escape? Was the real impact legal, geographic, or communal memory? Pick one and explain briefly in the comments. Thank you for watching.